Who built the Terracotta Army, and why did they vanish? In 1974, a group of farmers in central China were digging a well. They were looking for water. What they found was a face. Not a carving, not a statue of a god. A face, with eyelids, a mustache, and an expression. And behind that face, buried in the dirt, stood an army of thousands. Here's the part almost nobody asks about. Someone made them. Thousands of someones. And when the work was finished, those people vanished from history completely. The site sits near the modern city of Xi'an in Shaanxi province. Underneath the fields is a burial complex so large that archaeologists still haven't reached the end of it. The main tomb belongs to Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. He died in the year 210 BC. About a mile and a half east of his burial mound are the pits. Inside them, an estimated 8,000 clay soldiers, plus horses, plus wooden chariots that rotted away, leaving only their bronze fittings behind. The soldiers are roughly life-size. Some stand close to 2 meters tall. Each one weighs a few hundred kilograms. And they aren't identical. That's the detail that stops people in their tracks. Walk the pits today and you see infantry, archers, kneeling crossbowmen, officers in layered armor, generals with elaborate headdresses, different hairstyles, different beards, different builds, different expressions. Researchers have even studied the ears of the figures and found that no two are shaped quite the same way. Ears, like fingerprints, are hard to duplicate by accident. There's one more thing you need to imagine, because the version you've seen in photos is wrong. They weren't gray. Traces of pigment survive on many of the figures: reds, greens, purples, blues, whites. The army was painted, bright, almost gaudy colors. When the pits were opened, air and light attacked those pigments fast. Some flaked away within minutes of being exposed. So the gray army in every photograph is a ghost of the original. Now hold that image. 8,000 painted, individualized, life-size figures, and ask the obvious question: who actually made them? Start with the man who gave the order. He was born Ying Zheng, and he became king of the state of Qin as a child, around 13 years old. According to the historian Sima Qian, work on his tomb began almost immediately after he took the throne. Think about that timeline. A teenager takes power, and one of the first great projects of his reign is his own grave. Decades later, he did what no ruler before him had done. He conquered the rival states and welded them into a single empire. He took a new title, First Emperor. He standardized the script, the currency, the width of cart axles. He connected border walls into an early ancestor of what would become the Great Wall. And he became obsessed with not dying. The records describe him sending expeditions to search for an elixir of immortality. Some historians have suggested that the medicines his court alchemists produced may have contained mercury, which was believed at the time to extend life, and which is, of course, a poison. That's a plausible theory, not a proven cause of death. What we can say is this: a man that afraid of death does not build a modest grave. The tomb complex he ordered wasn't a room, it was a landscape. Walls, gates, stables, offices, pits of bronze waterfowl, pits of acrobats and musicians. A palace for the afterlife, staffed and defended, which meant it needed an army. And an army meant labor on a scale the world had barely attempted before. Here is where we have to be careful, because this is where the numbers start doing strange things. Sima Qian wrote his history around a century after the emperor died. In it, he states that more than 700,000 conscripted laborers were sent to work on the emperor's projects, the tomb at Mount Li, and a vast palace complex. 700,000. That figure is quoted everywhere. It's also genuinely disputed. Some historians accept it as roughly plausible for an empire mobilizing its population by force. Others argue it's a conventional number, the kind of enormous round figure ancient chroniclers used to mean an almost unimaginable number of people. Nobody has an independent census to check it against. So treat it as what it is, a recorded claim, not a verified head count. But here's what isn't in dispute. The workforce was massive, and much of it wasn't there voluntarily. Qin law was famously harsh. Punishment for a wide range of offenses meant conscription into hard labor. These convict laborers were a standard part of imperial construction. They were shipped in, worked, and used up, and archaeologists have found them. Near the tomb complex, excavations uncovered burial grounds containing human remains, laborers who died on site. Some of those graves included broken pottery fragments inscribed with information about the dead. A name, a place of origin, sometimes a legal status. Those shards are, in a very real sense, the only tombstones these people ever got. They tell us the workforce came from all over the newly conquered empire. Men pulled from their home regions and marched hundreds of kilometers to a construction site they would never leave. So we know they were there. We know some of them died there. What we still don't fully understand is how they made what they made. For a long time, the fact that no two faces are alike got explained the romantic way. That each warrior was modeled on a real soldier in the emperor's army. A portrait gallery in clay. The evidence points somewhere more interesting. Study the figures closely and a pattern appears. The bodies were built from standardized components. Legs, torsos, arms, hands, heads, produced separately in a limited number of basic types, then assembled. Ears and other details came from a set of molds that repeat across the collection. That's not mass production in the modern sense. It's modular production. A system. And after assembly came the hand finishing. Clay was added and carved to individualize the face. Hair was sculpted strand by strand. Armor scales, belt hooks, the tread pattern on the soles of a kneeling archer's shoes, all worked by hand. Then the whole thing was fired, at temperatures generally estimated to be close to 1,000 degrees Celsius. Firing a hollow figure that size without cracking it is difficult today. They did it thousands of times. Then it was painted, then it was armed, because the warriors originally carried real weapons. Bronze swords, spearheads, crossbow triggers, arrowheads. Tens of thousands of bronze arrowheads have been recovered. The components were made to consistent specifications, close enough that parts were effectively interchangeable. Some of those blades came out of the ground with barely any corrosion. For years, the popular explanation was that Qin metalworkers had invented a chromium anti-rust treatment 2,000 years early. More recent research has challenged that, suggesting the chromium traces came from lacquer used on nearby wooden parts, and that the real credit belongs to the unusually protective local soil. Impressive either way. Just not magic. And now the detail that changes everything. Many of the figures and weapons carry inscriptions, small stamped or incised marks, often hidden under an arm or inside a fold of clothing. They record the workshop and the name of the foreman responsible. Scholars have identified dozens of these names. This was quality control. If a figure failed, the empire knew exactly whose team to punish. Under Qin law, that was not a warning letter. So the Terracotta army isn't entirely anonymous. A few dozen supervisors signed their work under threat, which raises the obvious question. If we have the foremen's names, what happened to everyone underneath them? Sima Qian gives an answer. It is the single most disturbing passage in the account. He describes the emperor's burial, the underground chamber filled with treasures, automatic crossbows rigged to fire at intruders, a map of the empire laid out below, with the rivers and seas represented in flowing mercury. And then the ceiling. According to the text, once the coffin and the treasures were inside, the inner gate was shut and the outer gate was dropped, trapping the artisans and laborers who had built the mechanisms inside the tomb. Because they knew where everything was. Because they knew how the traps worked. Because they could be bought. None of them, the record says, came out. Now the caution this deserves. That passage was written roughly 100 years after the events, by a historian working under a later dynasty that had every political reason to portray the Qin as monstrous. Sima Qian did not witness it. He does not name a source. And the main burial chamber has never been opened, so no archaeologist has ever confirmed or disproven it. Many modern historians treat it as a plausible reflection of how ruthless the Qin state could be, and, at the same time, as an unverified claim that may be moralizing literature rather than reporting. So the honest version is this. An ancient record says the builders were sealed in. Archaeology has not confirmed it. It might be true. It might be a story about tyranny that people needed to tell. But Here's the thing that unsettles me most, and it doesn't depend on that passage at all. Whether they were sealed inside or simply released, the result was the same. They disappeared. No monument names them. No text lists them. The empire that recorded the width of a cart axle did not think their lives were worth writing down. Within a few years, the Qin dynasty itself collapsed. The pits were raided and burned. You can still see scorch marks and the crushed remains of figures that were smashed by human hands. And then the fields grew over the top. For roughly 2,000 years, the greatest sculptural project of the ancient world sat under farmland, and nobody knew. Local people occasionally turned up fragments of pottery figures while working the soil. Some reportedly considered them unlucky and buried them again, until a drought, a well, a shovel, and a face looking back. Today, the main burial mound is still unexcavated. Deliberately, part of that is preservation. The lesson of the paint that vanished on contact with air is not one archaeologists want to repeat on a larger scale. And part of it is the mercury. Soil surveys around the mound have detected unusually high mercury concentrations, in a pattern some researchers argue is consistent with Sima Qian's description of mercury rivers. It's suggestive. It isn't proof. So the emperor is still down there, unopened. And he's got exactly what he wanted. 22 centuries later, we are still saying his name. That's the part worth sitting with. We call it the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, one man's name attached to the labor of an entire generation. He didn't shape a single face. He didn't fire a single kiln. He gave an order, and hundreds of thousands of people spent their lives, and in many cases ended their lives, carrying it out. History does this constantly. It remembers the person who commissioned the thing and forgets the people who made it. But go and stand in front of those warriors and you'll notice something. The emperor's face is nowhere in that army. It was never carved. The faces down there belong to the workers. Different noses, different jaws, different eyes. Nobody knows exactly whose features they were based on or how much of it was pure invention. What we do know is that every one of them was pressed into shape by a pair of human hands, and that somebody, standing in a workshop 22 centuries ago, decided that this one should have a slightly crooked smile. That's the only signature most of them ever got. If you want more buried history like this, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, should they open the main tomb or leave the emperor exactly where he is?